Pass this around too. I picked this up around Christmas at a charity auction. It's a Missouri Division 1918 reunion in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And all this stuff around here tells you about this thing. This is the, it says on the rosette, Missouri Division, UCV, WC, whatever, Major General Commanding. And it was actually printed and made in St. Louis. You can still tell all that. When I talked to the auctioneer and the owner of this, he's had it for 30 years. He was an auctioneer, and about 30 years ago, they had 9 reunion things at a sale, and no one was too interested in them, so he picked up this one, and he put it in his drawer, and it's been there ever since. And he said, this is crazy. I'll let this benefit somebody at this charity and maybe get it out in the public more, so then I bought it at the auction. So I'll just pass that around. It's for a matron of honor. Obviously, this would be pretty tough to put on your coat and walk around with. So I am guessing the matrons must have wore that on off their waist. It's the only thing I can think of. So anyway, just a little thing I thought I would share with you before we get started here. If you look at the handout, we will understand why we have the zoo owl pictures here. I'll explain that in a minute. This is the main book. There are several other books about General Polinak and a few other people involved in this. And then here's a picture of the man I'm talking about again. He is a Yankee hero here, but it's still about our president that he tried to get. This is him when Cuba was fighting to be free from Spain. This is his family. And this is another picture of him when he's older in his tomb in Lincoln. And his Medal of Honor thing here that Sonny Wells put in. Some of you might remember him. So anyway, that's kind of look through those as I talk about them and get going. As you know, of course, I'm a Civil War addict, and I read and talk about this all the time. And every now and then I run across a wow thing. I read something, I say, wow, I just can't believe it. I never heard of this guy before. I never heard of this woman. Where is this battle? How can this be? And so that's when I sit down and try to write all this and put it together. And that's why you're trapped here again tonight, because I just know that you guys are going to get excited about this as I am and want to share it with you. Nobody could be quite as excited about this as I am because it had all the elements from my particular life that were pretty neat. First of all, it's a true story. It's heavily documented. 3 governments, our military records on both sides, letters, diaries, marriage licenses. This is definitely a true story, and I prefer them over fiction. And of course, they're about the Civil War era mostly, so that's pretty self-explanatory. It's about a very important person in the American Civil War, Jefferson Davis, and so I thought that was pretty interesting. And then of course, my favorite brigade of all the brigades in the whole war is the 1st Missouri Brigade, which I spent a lot of time studying. And every time it seems they turn around, they're fighting the Missouri Brigade, as we'll see. It's intertwined throughout this whole story also. And then of course, I finally find a Nebraska hero that isn't on the football team. If you don't know, all my ancestors are mostly from the Iowa-Nebraska border, and my living relatives are from Nebraska-Iowa border, and my wife and I own season tickets at Lincoln. So I do care what goes on in Nebraska without a doubt. I did go to the French teacher, and boy, there's not many of them around, in Belton, Missouri, to try to learn to pronounce these names in some of these places a little bit better. But if you know French better than I do, just make sure and correct me anytime you want. So let's get started. What starts in 1900, a new century is starting, it's 1900, and a man now in his mid-60s sits down to write about his memoirs and exciting days in the American Civil War, or the war for Second War for American Independence. His name is Victor Vifnock. He's a Frenchman, but of course he will become about more American than almost anybody before it's all said and done here. He called his manuscript, of course he wrote this out by hand, A Link from the Broken Chain, Historical Reminiscence from the Civil War Relating to an Attempt to Kidnap Jefferson Davis in 1862. When he died in 1904, it was still in manuscript form, and he gave it to his wife of 46 years, and pretty soon, eventually, 10 years later, she gives it to one of their sons. Their son's name is Blakely Marion Vifnock, and both those names come from his father's last 2 Civil War clashes. He was at Fort Blakely, so they named him Blakely, and he was from Marion because Marion, Alabama Railroad Junction is a neat story we'll get to eventually. And so he names him after his last two Civil War clashes. And finally, and later in his life, he decides to type it up, and he does so. And then on August 17, 1926, he gives it to the Nebraska Historical Society. And they put it in a box, and there it was. Finally, his great-great-grandson, a man named Jeffrey Smith, he says, I keep hearing rumors about my great-great-grandfather winning a Medal of Honor or something. He decides to investigate in it. And they go back and for a week they look it all over. They finally found this box and this manuscript, or we would never know about this. And the sad part is, it's probably true in a lot of counties, a lot of families, a lot of historical societies, national archives, state archives like this. There's probably just another 1,000 neat stories like this, but they've been boxed up and long forgotten. So anyway, he did care enough that he went and did that out of curiosity. This Jeffrey Smith still lives in Bellevue, Nebraska, which has now been swallowed up by Omaha. And he then approached another man to help him write the book. And that man just happens to be one of my famous Civil War authors. And he's the author of one of my favorite books of all time in the Civil War, called the Confederacy's Fighting Chaplain, Father John B. Bannon, who was, of course, a Catholic priest from St. Louis, Missouri. And just if you never read this book and you care about the 1st Missouri Brigade and you want a lot of details and interesting things, see how life really was miserable, you need to write this great story about Father Bannon and the 1st Missouri Brigade there. Thomas Tucker just so happened, the time he asked him to write this book, happened to live at Aqua Creek, which is right here, which will be part of our story. He could see Aqua Creek where he lives today. And they also, besides having interest in this subject, they are both PhDs from St. Louis University, which of course has a lot of 1st Missouri and 2nd Missouri Brigade stories behind it too. So it's very, very important. They kept 98% of what Victor had written in his manuscript. Every now and then he was a day off, or he misspelled a word or something like that, and they tried to correct some of those obvious mistakes. In his name, the A shouldn't be there, but his father's christening record, somebody by accident put the A in Vivquois, and so they just never changed it. They left it. They didn't have much family tradition before his father, so it didn't bother them too much, and they left it in there. So that's how it got misspelled a long time ago. Victor, of course, was born on May 20th, 1836, about almost exactly 25 years for the firing of Fort Sumter. He was christened Jean Baptiste Victor Vivquois. He was the son of Jean Baptiste Joseph Victoire, and his father was quite a famous man himself, a renowned French engineer, highly decorated veteran of Napoleon's cavalry. His father joined Napoleon in 1804 at the age of 16. He served in many places and was decorated by Napoleon as the Knight of Legion of Honor for acts of bravery. Then again in 1812, his father was designated as an officer of the Legion of Honor as a lieutenant colonel of cavalry. After the war, his father then went back to school, graduated with honors from the engineering school called Polytechnical School of Paris. That's our Yale. He was responsible, and still is, for many of the famous boulevards in Brussels, the canals at Poly-Malakak, Brussels, and the first cast iron bridge in Europe, on the European continent, and the world's first integrated rail network in Belgium. So his father was quite a man also, and as we'll see, he was quite a man too. Now, what's the worst thing that ever happened to a cavalryman when his son grows up? What's the worst thing he could want to be? His son grows up and wants to be a Navy man. Oh, Dad didn't like that at all. Victor, our Victor now, the guy we're studying here tonight, studied for admissions to Belgium's Imperial Polytechnical School for Navy Career. And his father said, no, not if you want to keep this name and live in this house and get all the wealth I'm going to leave you. And so instead of letting him stay in school there, he sent him as a 16-year-old in 1852 to America with another man a little older than him, just to get him away from this Navy school. So then 2 years later, his father's health deteriorates and he goes home to be with his father's last few days. And then he goes back to school himself. and he enrolls this time in the Belgium Military School, graduated in 1856 as a second lieutenant of cavalry. So his father didn't have to turn over in his grave anymore. And then he's only in the Belgium cavalry for a year, and then he goes back to New York City and heads west immediately. He's headed for Round Hill, Missouri, which is in Coopertown, just barely across into Coopertown on the southern edge there. Sometimes that's misprinted or miscalled Round Tree. And eventually, Round Hill will become Tipton, Missouri. It will move 3 miles further south and now be in Montague County. And that will be the major place. So everything's called Tipton, whether it really was early in this time or not. By the way, Tipton is named after a man, but it's not his first name, it's not his last name. It's his middle name. And the only thing I can think of, I haven't ever researched that much, it probably was his mother's maiden name. Some kind of honor to his mother. But anyway, so he goes there, and why does he go there? Because he is, oops, where the heck page 4 to go? He goes there to meet a young woman named Caroline Volema, and they had met each other in New York City 3 years ago and stayed in touch and contact with each other and apparently felt very strong toward each other. Her family was also Belgian immigrants. She was one of 7 children, born on the exact birthday of Victor's birthday, but just 2 years later. Her family had come to Louisiana, maybe that's where they get this Zouave stuff, to Missouri, and her father was a successful livestock farmer. He didn't stay there too long because they were married on September 1st, 1857 in Tipton, Missouri. 6 months later, they moved to a place that's hard to imagine. They didn't settle around Tipton, they didn't come to Independence, they didn't stay in western Missouri, went all the way 75 miles west of Nebraska City in Nebraska Territory. They were the only whites living there. They're surrounded by Sioux and Pawnee and all kinds of Indians, and they decided to settle there. The reason for this man going to such a strange place was his dream for his life was to build, they call it the Blue River Valley there, and he wanted to build a Belgian colony all the way through the Blue River Valley in the southeast part of Nebraska. And that's what why he did that. It really sounds strange at first. Anyway, there are several major roads to go west from there and nearby, but eventually one of those roads, once they put an iron bridge across the Blue River in 1861, will become the main road to Pikes Peak, Colorado for several generations. Now, it's not like the man is stuck out there on a farm by himself. We know he had always at least one farm hand and one woman helping his wife. And it's not, he's not the typical poor farmer per se, but I'm sure it was rough out there, and his family was in danger a lot. But anyway, to show you how unlost he was there, in 1859 he goes all the way to Brussels, Belgium, for his sister's wedding, and then comes back. Even today, I wouldn't want to set up a trip like that. That seemed like a long way to me, but he did that back in 1859. Obviously had some money, or he couldn't have done those kind of things either. He gets back, and almost immediately in 59 and 61, his 2 sons are born, first 2 sons. They have 8 children altogether, and of course his big dream was to build Belgian colonies. That never happens for obvious reasons in a few minutes, but he did eventually build a town on the Kansas-Nebraska border called Orleans, which is still there, and he built a town on the Colorado-Nebraska border. So he did get a little bit of his dream done. Then, of course, in April of 61, his life and millions of Americans' lives were changed by the firing of Fort Sumter, and he eagerly wanted to put his military training to the service of his adopted country. A year earlier, as a delegate to the Democratic Territorial Convention in Omaha, he had stated his stance on this issue. I quote, "After the service of the Marquis de Lafayette in the American Revolution, it is not necessary for a Frenchman to promise fidelity to the stars and stripes," unquote. So as we can see, he's pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool Union man here. And so pretty soon, in July of 61, he goes back to New York City. He is sure there's a lot of Frenchmen there that want to join him and other Frenchmen and jump into this fray. And so he studies all the stuff in the newspaper and all the recruiting bulletins, and he goes and he makes some friends, and he finally decides to join the 53rd New York Volunteer Infantry, Zouaves. And there is no picture of their exact uniforms because it only was in existence for a year, but this is two other sets of uniforms from New York groups during that time frame, so that gives you a little idea of what they were going to wear. And by the way, the whole regiment was pretty much made up of Frenchmen or Franco-Americans, primarily from Brooklyn, New York. So anyway, they had a leader called Lionel Jobard whatever his name is here, de Pinion, and he won't be too important to our characters other than he designed their uniforms that they wore, but we don't know what design that is. Anyway, he joined as a private, but as you can imagine, this guy is good looking, he's rich, he's had military training, he can speak French and English fluently and other languages, he's a musician, and he's great with a sword and great with a pistol, and so he didn't last as a private very long. Almost overnight he became a first lieutenant and the adjutant of the entire regiment. And then, of course, distributing and doing all the work that an adjutant does, you meet all the young officers, they have to come to your tent for the attendance rolls and all that kind of stuff. He met two other young Frenchmen that he really did like a great deal. One of them was Captain Alfred C.C. Puron, and the other one is Armand Ducouk. One of them was the commander of the Company F, and the other one was lieutenant in another group. The 53rd went on to Washington, D.C., then they went on to Annapolis, Maryland, and then they went with General Ambrose Burnside when he took his expedition on the North Carolina coast. And they have bad luck from the very beginning. They just barely get down there. There's a huge storm, and their ship, the John Tuck, was high-centered on a rock. And they couldn't get the men off, they couldn't get the men on. So they stayed there a month. As they hear all this other shooting and all this excitement. They're stuck on this ship for a month. And they get a bad disease from the colonel on down, and that is gambling. They start gambling and drinking night and day and carry on. And of course there's always some bitter feelings and some few fights. And C.C. Puron himself lost everything but his underwear. So he's running around the ship just in his underwear during this time. So and then of course you can imagine this group discipline problems pretty soon, then a few desertions, and then C.C. Puron himself got in a big hassle with the chief surgeon, got court-martialed. Lucky he didn't lose his life there, but the colonel was just as guilty as he was on a lot of those charges, and so he got him off. But so less than a year, the United States Army disbanded the 53rd New York Volunteer Infantry. Boom. All of a sudden these guys have no job. And that's when C.C. Puron and Armand Ducouk and our Victor decide to shorten the war by kidnapping Jefferson Davis. Okay, that's where this all starts. It's a 2-month adventure, and they eventually will get back to D.C. all together and all alive, but then go quickly their separate ways, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Had it not been for Victor's grandson, of course, going into the Nebraska Historical Society archives in the back, we would have never heard the story. Obviously, it was obscured by time already. There were very few participants. There were some high officials in the French embassy that knew this was going on, but not very many other people. And of course, there was limited consequences. There was never a headline about it. And so, again, it would have just simply been lost as Victor had not sat down and wrote his memoirs there. For a while, the three were joined by a fourth man named Viscount de Beaumont. And the key here is, and why he's so important, is he's the cousin of the French man in charge of the French embassy in Washington, D.C. And he's a cousin of, even more important, a Prince Cornelia Armand de Polignac. His own men couldn't say that, so they call him Polecat, General Colpat. And he was a general, brigadier general in the Confederate Army. And he will play a big role in them getting in and getting out of this safely. So that is very, very important to realize what's going on there. And by the way, that's a neat story in its own. He's quite an interesting fellow, this Polignac. They started out right away, and they took a room in a renowned National Hotel, which is still in existence, and the register has never been destroyed. It's still there. You can still see where these three guys sign in the register. So, I mean, the evidence of all this took place is pretty undisputable here. For their idea was to go as a guise as just 3 or 4 young Frenchmen as tourists going through the South and just checking things out. That was going to be what it was all about. But then they decided to take code names from Alexander Dumas' novel, The Three Musketeers. Victor was become the Gascon soldier of fortune called D'Artagnan. Alfred C.C. Prion was to become Athos, and Armand de Luc was to become Porthos, and Beaumont was to become Aramis. And so they take on these code names and they keep this Three Musketeer plan all the way through these 2 months. They left D.C. on March 30th, 1862. They first of all went to Alexandria, which is just south of the capital, and had some exciting adventures. Every day was an exciting adventure. But here, of course, they had to get through one dead man zone and then through the other dead man zone without getting shot by either side or captured. So they finally get through Alexandria there. And by the way, when they were at Alexander, they stayed at the Marshall House. Another very famous place is still there. That's where the Southern guy, Yankee brought down the Confederate flag and he was shot, and then that guy was shot, and all that is still a big trivia thing in a lot of places. Then by April 2nd, they were to Manassas, where Porthos accidentally shot himself in the hand while he was cleaning his pistol and had to go back. And he never will again be involved in this situation. So it is truly now the Three Musketeers and not the Four. The Four, by the way, when they are in Washington, D.C., had made a lot of powerful men and a lot of rich friends. Senator Hale and his family, W.G. Penfield, who was a multimillionaire from Connecticut gun manufacturer. They met Senator Hale, they met General Banks. They were just really nice guys to kind of be around, and so they made a lot of contacts there. And of course, they were in and out of the French embassy whenever they wanted to. Naturally, the Union side didn't want to make the French mad because they didn't want them to help the French in the war. And the Confederates babied the French all the way through this situation because they didn't want the French to get mad at them, particularly high-ranking, well-known Frenchmen, because they wanted the French to come help the Confederates, which of course didn't happen, which we'll go into here pretty soon. So anyway, that's important to realize. These are pretty special guys we're talking about here. They hardly get south of D.C. here and they say, this walking all the way to Richmond is stupid. So they bought 3 horses with gold from a farmer named Johnny Walker, who he will come back to haunt them later. But anyway, they do buy the horses and take off. And of course, they used Negroes all the way along for food, for sleeping, for hiding out, and for information. As they made their way south, particularly Southern men didn't like them. They were kind of cocky and egotistical, and they all thought all Frenchmen were spies. And by the way, Washington, D.C. and Richmond, it was just unbelievable amount of spies and people there, and there were a lot of Frenchmen doing that. And actually, it's pretty good records in the U.S. Military records that they kind of suspected these guys all along, and we're keeping an eye on them. But anyway, it was pretty much that. When they do get down to Fredericksburg, they do hear about the Battle of Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing, and they are amazed how sad and how depressed so quickly the Southerners are when they lost that battle. But you stop and think about it. They had them on the run. They were deep in the Union territory. They were just about to do something unbelievable, and they were pushed back on the next day. And they try to cross a river here, and one of the horses gets shot, and the other 2 run back. We assume back to Mr. Walker's farm, so we got both the gold and the horses back. And they're shot by Texas Rangers, who then take him to then Colonel Fitzhugh Lee, which we all know of. And then what you might not know about Fitzhugh Lee was he spoke fluent French and had spent a tremendous amount of time just before the war in Paris himself. So here's these 3 guys, and then where have you been there? Have you been there? Did you have a drink here? And all that. And pretty soon these guys are pretty well buddies. And so Fitzhugh Lee says, well, I've got to send you down to General Weiner, who's our provost marshal and in charge of all of our prison camps, and I got to send you to General Smith. And so they're only gone halfway here, and now the Confederate government puts them on a train and sends them to Richmond, and allows them to keep their swords and their guns and their papers and their clothing and everything, so they get a free ride most of the way down to Richmond. They were amazed when they entered Richmond that daily life is just going on like usual. Remember, they just left Washington, D.C., which had 28 forts around it. And they get to Richmond, there's not a fort, there's no fortifications, there's no excitement, there's no worry. They were really amazed by that. And so, anyway, they get down there. Now, let me just briefly tell you what their plan was from the very beginning in order to capture, or to kidnap, excuse me, Jefferson Davis. And that was that they had learned before they left Washington, D.C., that Davis often took a little tug from Richmond down to the Norfolk Navy Yards and then come right back. And one of the reasons he went there all the time was to check on the progress of the Virginia, how it was being converted from a wooden ship to an ironclad. Jefferson Davis knew how unbelievably important that could be. And in fact, the actual Monitor battle actually took place right in here too. So they would get on in Richmond, they would get on the James River and go down here, then get on the James River and go down there. And later I'll tell you how they got a lot of good information about that. It's 110 miles. It takes 8 hours to go down, 12 to come back. The little tug had all the coal on it needed for the whole trip, and they only needed to make one water stop. So they start learning this stuff as they go down through here. And again, I know you guys probably don't need the explanation, but the Peninsula campaign is very important early in the war, and eventually Yorktown, Norfolk, Fort Monroe, and Williamsburg will all fall. And of course, McClellan has come out of Washington, D.C., down the Potomac River, and setting up a huge base camp down here to start the Peninsula Drive. And as you can see, this purple indicates how you go funnel right into Richmond, and you can also go two different directions to funnel into to Petersburg. So this is the campaign we're talking about. And we'll see how McClellan continues to do here in a minute. Actually, he did quite well down there. So anyway, that's kind of the starting point. Well, anyway, they're taken to Richmond, and they're taken to General Smith, who does not like them or their attitude right away, and insists on arresting them for stealing 3 horses, because Johnny Walker has told somebody that they stole the horses, didn't pay for them, and for spying. So he's not very high on these people at all. And he puts them in a jail for a while, and while they're in jail, they can hear a slave auction and partially see the slave auction, and it kind of reinforces them that, this is not a good thing here. But then the fact that Prince Camille Armand de Polignac, Polecat, he is called into the picture here because he's their cousin, and he pulls a lot of strings, and they are paroled in Richmond, allowed to keep their guns, swords, and everything. And they don't just go to the French embassy and to stay, but they go there and they use the bank there. Several times they get another $1,000 out of a bank draft from Paris from the French embassy in Richmond. But they go and they're allowed to rent an apartment in the 3rd story of Major Dennison's house. Major Dennison lives right across the street from the Department of War in Richmond. He is a top ordnance man. He meets with Jefferson Davis almost every day. And for Jefferson Davis to walk home like he did a lot, he goes right to Major Dennison's house and on down to his residence down the street there. And so that will play a big role in all this too here. A lot of things kind of fall in place for them right off the bat here. So they get new clothes. They think their clothes look too northern. And they get in this Major Dennison's apartment house. And it allows them an awful lot of freedom. And by the way, Major Dennison has a sweet young daughter named Miss Alice. And we'll see where that romance goes before it's all over. Athos is about ready to give up on the kidnap, and then they start reading things in the Richmond Dispatch that give them a lot more information, the 110 miles. They have all the coal on board they need to make the trip. They always leave at 10 at night and get back at 6 a.m. in the next morning. And then, of course, they go down to kind of look the tug over or see if they can find it. And they not only find it, but D'Artagnan makes friends with the captain of the tug, who happens to be a Creole, who happens to know French and loves Paris. So they become friends right away. And pretty soon they learn this 10 by 10, the Negroes sleep here, and that's Jefferson Davis's little place to sleep there. And all the information they ever wanted or needed was right there from this particular man. And in fact, to get a few last minute details from them, they invite him up to their apartment one night, and they wine and dine him and get him a little drunk, and they ask him everything he wants, and he tells them everything they need to know before it's all said and done. One time coming back from the tug, they do see a man hanging from a third-story window with a sack over his head by his neck, and he's dead, and they ask, what's the deal? And they say, oh, that's a spy. And so they start thinking, whoops, maybe we better slow down here just a little bit. So anyway, they learn a lot of stuff. And they also learn that Jefferson Davis walks to work and walks home almost every day right past Major Dennison's apartment. So they set it up where they see him coming one night. The first time they see him coming, he's actually got his little daughter by the hand walking her by. And so Amira, just, as I said, is a great singer, a piano player, banjo player. He's singing French songs, Southern songs in French, and pounding out the music. And Jefferson Davis' little daughter stopped. Pretty soon there's 5 or 6 more people and a couple of ladies. He plays about 5 or 6 songs, and they all clap for him. And a couple days later, he comes by again, and he's playing again, and they clap again. And we know of at least 2 times he acquired information from Major Dennison on who is that guy. Boy, he is good. So anyway, they're already kind of getting an inroad here. They learn that there's only 8 men on the tug normally. 3 of them are Negroes, and they don't count them. They just assume these 3 Negroes will do anything for their freedom and not be loyal. And they also learn from the Creole that one of the Negroes is very capable of operating a boat, steering it and doing whatever is necessary to get down and back. So they just figure they're going to knock out the other 3. They brought a drug from Washington, D.C. Once you take it, you're out for 10 hours like, man, you're out. And they're not going to do that to the 3 Negroes. They're going to use them to help get the tug down where they want and everything. Now the whole plot here is very essential. Don't want to forget telling you about that. Is the fact that when the ship gets down here to the Norfolk Naval Yards, if they take control of the tug, all they have to do is go 20 minutes around the corner, and they're going to be in with McClellan's army, who has now taken these 3 spots. So that's pretty simple and very quick for them. So the plan itself is turning out to be a pretty effective looking little plan here for a while. And didn't want to tell you about that. Then of course we have a little romance in this. The Negro servant of Miss Ellis brings Aramis flowers with a blank card several times. Well, everybody knows who it's from, but it doesn't matter. And they see each other going up and down the stairs, and eventually Major Dennison asks the 3 to come down and play the piano and sing for the family. They have a dinner, and Aramis and Miss Alice get to sit next to each other, and from then on they're in love, period. That is about all you can say about it. So anyway, the French minister from D.C., who's a cousin of one of these men, as I talked to you about, he comes to Richmond supposedly on business of settling an entire ship full of tobacco that's not been paid for, but he doesn't come for that real reason. He's coming down on behalf of the French to figure out whether the French government should really help the Confederacy. And during this trip, he decides that the Confederates can't possibly win on manufacturers, numbers, and things, and he pretty well decides, particularly if England won't come in with them very easily, that the French will not ever get involved with the Confederacy. So this is really a big thing here. And by the way, of course, when he's at the French embassy, these 3 musketeers go there and they party and drink, have fun and sing and everything with him too. So they know just about everybody already here. So that is a very, very important thing. Then, of course, the plot, they kept trying to get more details set on the plot. And of course the idea would be to get Jefferson Davis himself to invite him on the tug for a little trip down to Norfolk and back. Or second, the last minute before it leaves the shore, to jump him, take control, drug all of them at the 3 Negroes, and get down there and see this plot finished. And so that's actually going pretty darn good with them, except McClellan, for once in his life, starts winning battles, as I said. McClellan starts taking all these places down here, setting up this huge camp of 100,000 men and cannons and horses and everything to boot. And the fear is for our 3 musketeers at this time, is if he takes these places, and he does take all 4 of these, then just before they get to Norfolk, they've already known, several people have told them they're going to set fire and destroy and blow up everything there, including the Virginia. So there'll be no reason for Jefferson Davis to go to Norfolk anymore. And it's getting worse and worse in this situation because McClellan is winning and taking and setting up this huge base camp down there at the bottom of the peninsula here. So anyway, let's just see. So I think I covered a lot of this. Oh, by the way, it's kind of a mystery to me, and as much as I've read about this, I still don't quite understand it. They have decided all along they will never kill Jefferson Davis, and they had all kinds of chances to do that. With the exception, if they get started on this plan to a kidnapping, and they get halfway down or 3/4 way down, and it goes to heck, they are going to blow up the boat with themselves, and Jefferson Davis, everybody on it, will be killed. And of course, they've seen that guy hanging from the third-story window. They know what to do to spies down there, so they figure they might as well do that. At first, they argue about that quite a bit, and only one of them's in favor of that, but eventually they all realize, well, we might as well blow ourselves up as get hung the next day, and so forth. But again, I'm not quite sure in my own mind why killing him wouldn't be just as effective as kidnapping him. We're awful early in the war here yet. We're still in 62. The Southerners haven't given up any hope. They almost won the Battle of Shiloh. But they have made a pact, and they all agree not to harm a hair on his head unless they have to blow up the tugboat halfway through the operation. And they do have lots of chances they could have done that. But I really don't quite understand their philosophy there. But anyway, they also make a friend of Secretary Judea Benjamin, who, by the way, speaks fluent French and has been in Paris lots of times. So they're really getting in with the big boys all around town. The secretary, Benjamin, invites them to his house for a party 3 days from now in which Jefferson Davis is going to be there, and Jefferson Davis has already asked if Aramis will sing and play for him. So this is going to be their big chance to get in with Jefferson